Hello, boys and girls. If you can hear snoring, it's not me. The dog is asleep. And I don't know what she's dreaming about, but she's making all sorts of snuffly sounds. So if you hear that, then apologies, but I don't want to go waking her up. Well, I hope you're ready for a story. And in this week's chapter of Heart in a Suitcase, we will be going to Ireland. This is another trip with my dad. So if you missed... Oh, she's awake. She's awake and looking at me. Yes, you relax. You relax. Maybe I'll introduce you to her at the end of the video. She's not my dog, though. I'm looking after her for my sister. Yes, in last week's we had a trip with my dad. We went to Mauritius, and so this is another trip with my dad. If you're interested in hearing the little story about Mauritius with my dad, then feel free to go and check it out. But for these first few chapters, they're kind of just setting the scene of my love for travel and a little bit of background about me before the next few chapters when we'll start getting into my... love life, and that's where you'll discover that the reason why it's called Heart in a Suitcase, because at the moment you're probably just thinking, honey, these are just stories about the suitcases, but gotta set the scene. Okay, anyway, right, let's get into it. So yes, Heart in a Suitcase, chapter 3. Are we on 3 or 4? I think we're on chapter 4. Let's have a look. Yeah, here we go. This is chapter 3. Ireland. My first ever best friend was a boy named Brendan, who lived 2 doors down from me when we were children. We played together every day, climbing trees, making up games, and just playing together as children do, from morning until our parents called us in for dinner. Brendan's dad terrified me as a child. He had a big white moustache that hung over his mouth and made his hard Northern Irish accent even harder for me to understand. I always thought he was telling me off for something, when in reality it was probably just his accent. Everyone said Brendan and I were puppy love, but in reality I was just one of the boys, and there was nothing more to it than childhood friendship. It was a heartbreaking day for me, though, when Brendan moved away to Ireland at the age of 7. At only 3 months older than me, I had never been without him for long in all those years, and we kept in touch for years after he moved as pen pals, writing in multicoloured pens on neon notepaper. Honestly, it's a wonder we didn't give ourselves headaches. One day when I had just turned 14, my dad announced that he was taking me to visit Brendan. I was so excited. It had been half our lives ago that I lost him, and after a few days of travelling around the beautiful countryside of Ireland, that I found myself being driven up his road towards his house in Wexford, just as Swear It Again by Westlife came on the radio, being announced as the new #1 chart single that week. In the days before, my father and I had been travelling all around Ireland. Some of the towns were just as you imagine, with rolling green hills full of farms and the sounds of sheep bleating in the fields. It was wet but not too cold while we were there, but I do remember just how quiet it was. I had my first experience of staying in a hostel, but finding it eerie as we walked through the large room full of bunk beds, but with no people in them. I'm not sure why it was so quiet at that time, but it meant that we had the place to ourselves and at the fraction of the price of a hotel. I remember finding Dublin a bit of a surprise. I expected it to be a fun city, like the Irish ladies and gentlemen dancing around the streets, but instead I just found it to be a bit dingy and full of very drunk men stumbling around. I supposed as an adult I would probably enjoy it more, but at 14 I was not frequenting the pubs, and I guessed that that's where the dancers must have been hiding themselves. Little side note here, I have as an adult been back to Dublin And I most definitely enjoyed it a lot more being allowed to go into the pubs. But let's get back to the story. Crossing the border into Northern Ireland as we headed for Belfast, I found myself for the first time feeling unsafe and scared. There were many streets with the colours of the Union Jack painted on the separate bricks of the curb and black silhouettes of soldiers graffitied onto the walls, menacingly large with guns aimed ready to fire. It may have only been graffiti, but as a young person who had never seen anywhere with political threats sprayed onto the roads and no desire to watch the news as it was far too boring and for grown-ups, I didn't understand what it was all there for, and I thought that I had accidentally entered into a war zone. In Wexford, after visiting the Wexford Crystal Shop, Brendan and I spent one last afternoon together. Although it was not playing games like as children, more hanging out as teenagers do. Talking about Westlife and what the old hometown was like now. He showed me the nearby beach where Saving Private Ryan was filmed, and it was surprising to hear that he too now had an Irish accent, but a soft Southern Irish, stark contrast to his father's. After that last encounter, our letters petered out until one day, probably half a decade later, I realised that we hadn't spoken in such a long time, I no longer even had his address. I still wonder if we would have stayed such good friends if he hadn't moved. Would we have gone our separate ways naturally when we reached the age of boys smell and girls can't play football? Or maybe teenage hormones would have turned us into puppy love for real? I know his father sadly passed away and Brendan married his real childhood sweetheart, but that's about all I know of his life now. Well, that was Ireland. At that juncture, I think I'm going to show you guys something. Not the dog, I'll show you the dog afterwards. Because my goddaughter and her friend are actually the ones that designed my book cover. I'm absolutely so impressed that they've done this because of just how much thought and details have gone into it. So I really like to show you guys. First of all, we have the front cover, which obviously has the title, Heart in a Suitcase. And even the fact that the suitcase itself, and this is going to contain some spoiler alerts here, but the suitcase itself actually has all the little stamps and pictures of like some of the places that are going to be mentioned coming up in the following chapters. So let me see if you guys can see that. Isn't it cool? So we've got the flag for the UAE. There's Italy there. We've already had Italy. There's the Eiffel Tower and the Australian flag. I just thought it was so cool. And even as well as that, I mean, firstly, that's really cool. But secondly, the back. Isn't it brilliant? I love it. I'm going to read it to you. Okay, so Heart in a Suitcase is an autobiographical memoir of all the romances in my life thus far, told through my travels. All tales within this book are true to my personal perspective. Others mentioned may have a different point of view on things. All names have been changed for anonymity and respect of privacy of those mentioned. About the author, this bit's great. Stephanie Saint-Remy lives in Stephanie Saint-Remy lives in some town in a country with herself and whoever and whatever pet she chooses at whatever given time. She's an accomplished waffler of words and enjoys sharing her nonsense with others. Oh my gosh, honestly, I'm so proud of that. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, go on then. For those of you still waiting to see the dog, let me go and get her for you. Hold on. Little Pooch Magooch down here didn't want to get up to say hello, so I thought I'd bring you to her. Hello, Bubby. Hello, Bubby. People want to say hello to you. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Well, thank you ever so much for tuning in today, guys, and hopefully I'll see you next week for the next chapter of Heart in a Suitcase from me and the doggy. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.